Alright, if you remember last week, we tested a solid state drive versus a hard drive to see what kind of effect they had on both our load times, but also specifically I wanted to see what effect they had on the end turn times, and we found that they had, well, effectively no effect on the end turn times. However, one of the other extremely common suggestions I see for improving end turn times is to go to a faster or larger set of RAM, so that's exactly what we're going to check today. To do this, I will use the pre-existing RAM that we used in last video, which is 16 gigabytes of G.Skills 3200 megahertz 1618-1836 RAM. I will also downclock that same set of RAM down to 2400 megahertz and see if that has any difference for us. I also have an additional 48 gigabytes, well actually total of 64 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance 64 gigabytes of RAM. Again, same timings, 16, 18, 18, and 3200 megahertz. However, there is a huge asterisk for the Corsair stuff, and I'm really annoyed with them. We will get to that when I get to that particular section of the video. So, what is RAM? Why does this matter for our game? Well, I'll give you an explanation of why that is. However, for those of you who already, have the technical knowledge and all that kind of stuff, no worries. I'll leave timestamps down in the description. You can skip past this section into anywhere you want to go. For the rest of you, though, I find that using a metaphor for the computer is actually easier than trying to go to the technical definitions you'll get from most computer sites. If we look at the computer and we interpret it as being a human brain, this actually helps define what it is that the RAM is doing for us. So for example, last week we were looking at storage options. These would be akin to your human long-term memory. This is stuff that you might not need immediately or even day to day, but it's stuff you'll hold on to because it has an important reasoning for it and you can access it whenever you need. Short-term memory, for example, would be RAM. This is stuff that you might need to act upon immediately, or stuff you need to queue up for the next few moments, or even stuff you might not even subconsciously have to think about, but that your brain is holding on to temporarily just in case it's required. Now, just like short-term memory, it will not hold on to it forever. Eventually, you will forget the vast majority of stuff in your short-term memory because it doesn't matter, and RAM is the same way too. When the computer shuts down, it will forget it. Now, what does this actually benefit the computer? What does it do? Basically, your CPU is really good at processing data, but it can only process data one thing at a time. So what it needs to happen, especially in something big and complex like a computer game, is it needs to queue up all the stuff that it needs to sort through, and that's what the RAM does. It sort of creates a backlog for the CPU to hash through as much as it can. So there's actually a lot more to RAM than what our very simple metaphor allows for. For example, it has interactions with predictive algorithms, CPU caching, your video card's VRAM cache. There's a lot of stuff going on underneath the hood here that we didn't really get into, but we don't need to get into it. That's a lot more complication than what we need for this particular video. In general, RAM benefits games for the simple fact that games are big by nature. The CPU can't try to get through the entire 60 gigabytes of Total War all in one shot, so instead what RAM will do would be to grab chunks of the game, maybe the AI's behavior, maybe the campaign map, and then, the individual armies and XYZ, and store them up into nice big chunks for the CPU to blitz through in an efficient process. Because the CPU is working more efficiently, it therefore can do more stuff, and in most games, you will see a higher frames per second count. Now, this doesn't actually really hold up particularly well for Total Warhammer, because in general, it's not going to be a frames per second difference that we're going to see, it's actually going to be a calculation difference that we're going to see. So for games like Total Warhammer, or in general turn-based games like 4X's and the like, the CPU has to do a huge chunk of calculation all at once, which is the end of the turn. And usually this is where a ton of RAM can help you out. However, there is a limit to this. Adding more RAM once the CPU has the maximum amount of RAM it can use is no longer beneficial, it's just wasted space. The thing that will typically benefit things like this is RAM frequency. How fast can it think of this data? Now, Total War has an additional wrinkle over most other games too, not just from its turn-based nature, but also because of how old its engine is. The engine that Total Warhammer is using is really old at this point in time, and it was designed in an era where something like a 4-core CPU was considered to be very exotic and rare. As a result, Total Warhammer's engine doesn't actually really take advantage of multi-core CPUs, not like something like, say, Ashes of the Singularity would. As a result, Total Warhammer's performance is extremely beholden to single-core performance, which is something that really hasn't increased in quite a lot of years. However, one of the things that can benefit single-core performance is allowing that single core to make as much advantage of RAM as possible, and this is something where RAM could actually show up quite well. So how do we test this then if we have two different factors to take a look at? We have both frames per second and computational speed. Well, the computational speed is actually fairly easy. We actually sort of took a look at this last time with the times required to do end turns and new campaigns. So we'll reuse those data sets and test it with all the new kits. And then for the frames per second, we will use the laboratory benchmark with everything set to 100%. Just like last time, we have a Ryzen 2700 system with a 280mm radiator and the stock clocks and no boost clock permitted. Once again, it's on an X470 motherboard running Windows 7 64-bit. Again, don't ask. We have the same solid state drive as last run with nothing else has been installed or disabled, so we'll reuse the figures from that. We have the same Vega Frontier Edition liquid cooled, once again stock clocks and no boost clocks permitted. I should also specify where I live remains below freezing, so just like last time, temperatures and thermals will not be affected, as well as the fact that we can reuse last week's results. For the game itself, I have every single option cranked up to the maximum with the resolution set to 1080p, as that's what my display is. And I also have the no LOD mod on, so this should be the harshest possible setup I can possibly force upon the system in order to get the biggest swings relative to RAM. But that's enough dilly-dallying, let's get into the results themselves. So we'll start with the 3200 set of 16GB because this is the stuff we already did. If you remember from last week, we had an average of 89 seconds with a 1 second deviation, with one of the 88 second runs emitted for being too fast and the 150 second run emitted for being too slow. We also tried end turn times and measured those. On average, they took 45 seconds, again with a 1 second deviation. This is generally just how fast I could click through stuff. There was a 44 second run emitted for being too fast and a 47 second run emitted for being too slow. And then the last thing, the new thing that I measured is the frames per second on the laboratory benchmark. This one had a 37.7 frame per second average with a only 0.1 second frame per second deviation, with a 37.9 frame per second run emitted and a 37.4 frame per second run emitted for being too fast and too slow respectively. Alright, so what happens when we crank that RAM speed lower? So to do this, I set the base speed to 2400 megahertz with timings of 17, 17, 17, 37. Yeah, the timings are technically a little bit better than the 3200 is, but given how much dramatically slower the actual RAM is, this should still produce worse results. Although weirdly, the Mortal Empire's loading didn't actually show me that. It actually made 84 seconds on average with a 1 second deviation, which is actually 5 seconds better than what the 3200 was. For the record, it had an 89 second emission for too slow and an 83 second emission for too fast. But things get back on track once we start going to end turn times. So this took an average of 46 seconds on average with a 3 second deviation, which is 1 second worse across the board than you'll notice for the 3200 megahertz. And that 3 second deviation is quite a large swing. I think this is where we can finally see the CPU starting to get choked down by the RAM. There was a 43 second emission for being too fast and a 62 second emission for being too slow. But as a note on that 62 second emission, two dialogue options that I hadn't seen pop up in anywhere else in my runs kind of caught me by surprise, so I screwed up in trying to click through them fast enough. So that's where that one slow thing came from. As a side note too, I also noticed that anytime I change anything in the BIOS or anything in the hardware, it seemed to almost like reset the seed for the campaign, which it didn't do if I had just shut down my computer and started up my computer with everything else being the exact same. So I'm not really sure what happened there, and it's not like it changes every time either. Like if I killed the game, started up the game, and tried it again, like I would get consistent 7 runs for some reason. I will discuss the things that changed at the end of the video just so that we all have sort of common footing and know what we're looking at. But just understand that these smaller changes, like the 1 second here or there, they might not necessarily be down to speed. They might actually be down to whether or not things changed. Lastly, going over to the benchmark, this is where things really started to show. So we had an average of 35.4 frames per second with a 0.1 frame per second deviation, which you'll notice is 2.3 frames per second less than the 3200 megahertz run. And on top of that too, 2.3 frames per second might not sound huge, even though it's almost 10%, but the thing is that it all came off on the lower end. So the highs were both 70 frames per second for both runs, but the lows dropped down big time. The lowest on the 3200 megahertz set was about 25 frames per second. The lowest on the 2400 megahertz run was about 19 frames per second, which is pretty much a slideshow at that point. So definitely makes a bigger difference for battles, I noticed. For the record, we had a 35.3 frame per second run emitted for being too slow and a 35.6 frame per second run emitted for being too fast. Alright, so now we've seen what a different speed can make, let's see what a different capacity can make. So we'll keep this one at the exact same speed as the previous run, this being 2400 megahertz at 17, 17, 17, 37 timings. So for this, the new campaigns was 84-second average with a 0-second deviation. It was always 84 seconds, with an omitted run of 83 seconds and an omitted run of 89 seconds. This was kind of cool to me to actually see that as long as we have enough capacity for the CPU to use, that doesn't actually deviate at all, it never changes. As for the end turn times, these were 40 seconds on average, with a 2-second deviation, and a 41-second run omitted for being too fast, and a 50-second run omitted for being too slow. Yeah, this is 1 second worse than the previous one. I'm willing to chalk that up to margin of error and little tiny changes in between. But where things get a little bit more interesting to me is in the frames per second for the benchmark. This averaged out at 36.1 frame per second average with a 0.1 frame per second deviation. So yeah, this is 1 frames per second less than the faster RAM, but this is also 0.7 frames per second more than less RAM. There was a 35.9 frame per second run emitted for too slow, 36.2 emitted for too fast. But again, this was also kind of interesting to see. Again, when this says less or more, this is almost always referring to minimum frame rates, which are the ones that you will notice dramatically faster than you will the standard frame rates. So the next run was supposed to be 64 gigs at 3200 megahertz with the same timings as the first run, 16, 18, 18, 36. This is actually what the Corsair LPX is designed to be able to run. It's right on the box and everything like that. But the RAM was completely unable to hold 3200 megahertz, even if I loosened the timings way off. This really annoyed me because this is essentially false advertising to me. And I mean, even 3066 megahertz was technically possible, but only if I gave it super loose timings, and even then it was still very unstable. So like it was hugely worse performance if I tried to do it that way. I had to go all the way down to 2933 megahertz in order to keep some decent timings and stability. But I mean, that's way off of where the speed of the RAM's supposed to be. That's a 10% drop. I'm pretty annoyed by this. I sent in a request to Corsair, but as of the timing of this, or as of the filming of this video, I haven't heard a peep back, and it's been, 4 days, I guess, now. Didn't have this problem with the G-Skill sticks from before, which were also cheaper. So like, I'm really, until I hear otherwise, if you're looking for RAM, personal suggestion, stay the hell away from Corsair, go over to G-Skill instead. So again, it won't be a perfect 1-to-1, but at 2933 with 14, 16, 16, 34 timings, that was the best I could get it to hold. So we'll just have to do a sort of comparison with fairly fast versus properly fast in the meantime. For the actual measurements themselves, a new campaign took an average of 82 seconds with a 1 second deviation in between, which is a whopping 7 seconds better than average. 7 seconds might not sound huge, but that's actually about a 10% gap in speed. It's pretty noticeable when you're actually doing it. There was an 80-second run emitted for being too fast and an 82-second run emitted for being too slow. Moving over to end turn times, we had a 41-second average with a 1 second deviation, which, yes, is 4 seconds better, which would also be about 10%. Here again, almost nothing happened in this run, so neither of the dialogues tripped, one of the armies didn't move, one of the armies didn't attack. There was a lot of stuff missing. Of that 4 seconds, I would be willing to bet that at least 3 seconds of it is just stuff that didn't happen. But even still, maybe a minor uptick in speed. Anyways, there was a 40-second run emitted for being too fast, 43-second run emitted for being too slow, but the really interesting result was the benchmark at the end. Here we got a 39 frame per second average with a 0.1 frame per second deviation, which you'll notice is 2.3 frames per second more than the 3200 megahertz test was, and 3.9 frames per second more than what the 2400 megahertz of 64 gigs was. Pretty noticeable jump up in performance there, and in fact, I actually think that's the single biggest jump for performance. There was a 38.7 frame per second emission for too slow, 39.2 emitted for too fast. But this is where, faster RAM, especially more of it, can really start to show itself as being a benefit. Once again, those frames per second gains you're seeing are almost entirely from minimums. Here, I didn't even touch, I think, below 30 the entire run on any of the runs. So pretty healthy gain there. So I mentioned that the end turns, a lot of the campaign seeds seem to change on every single hardware or BIOS change, but some of the things that never changed was Clan Wars always got destroyed, Wisdom of the Ash always finished being research, Age of Discovery's event always trips, Defenders of the Great Plan always moved into my range and become discovered, Alithanar always ends up attacking my Vol's Anvil and wins, Negorond always ends up sending 2 armies to break my siege on their capital and they win, Malekith always attacks my Serpent Coast, he always wins and raises the territory, Corhail always attacks Torgard with 2 armies and wins that one. Some of the variables, however, I got non-aggression pact offers from Scourge of Cain and or Calidor. Clan Molder would sometimes move into one of my ambushes and lose. Alethanar would sometimes send an agent to steal technology and fail. Various rogue armies would try to move around near my northern settlements. And the Knights of the Flame and Followers of Nagash would sometimes go for a peace treaty. Alright, so what are some conclusions we can draw from this? Well, let's start with the first one. Does ram speed affect performance? Yeah, pretty dramatically actually. For calculation-based things it can help a little bit, but that's typically only if it's already the bottleneck in the system. As for battles though, that can make a pretty noticeable performance difference right all on its own. Next up, does RAM capacity affect performance? Yeah, though here again, only in the sense that it can remove a bottleneck if you don't have enough of it. Does RAM speed or capacity affect end turn times? I suppose technically maybe a very, very teeny tiny amount, but small enough that it's, I would argue, irrelevant, especially with how fast the turn times go since the Potion of Speed update. If you're buying RAM, should you buy slower but larger RAM or faster but smaller RAM? In general, my advice here would be to aim for faster RAM and to try and keep it to a fairly high capacity per stick, and then just use less sticks to keep the cost down. That way, if you want to upgrade in the future, you still have the option to, you're not locked to whatever you did initially. Total Warhammer and most programs will definitely notice speed a lot more than they'll notice capacity. Should you buy better RAM in general for gaming? Honestly, no. The cost to benefit ratio here is just atrocious. Given that getting that 64GB set cost a whopping $400 Canadian, and for that entirely ludicrous cost, we benefited only by about 4.6 frames per second in between the slowest and smallest results versus the largest and fastest results. And bearing in mind, this is on a Ryzen CPU, which tends to benefit fairly heavily from RAM speed, and also on Total Warhammer, which itself is also a pretty niche case for RAM usage. I would suggest to use that money on a better GPU, CPU, motherboard, or cooling, or hell, even an SSD. RAM should basically be your last upgrade to aim for, in my opinion. If you only play Total Warhammer, then sure, maybe look at bumping up your RAM down the road, but even there, I'd still say save it for last. Like last week's SSD, for example, made way more of a difference for a lot less money. So, with RAM, is there anything I can do to increase my performance without spending money? Yeah, certainly. I mean, most RAM can be fairly overclocked fairly easily, as most manufacturers will only list the guaranteed minimums for speed. So, for example, if you see a RAM stick that says 16, 18, 18, 36, and 3200 megahertz, those are the minimums it should be able to hit. You might be able to go to tighter timings or faster peak speed. And regarding that too, even if you have a lower end set of RAM that you might not necessarily be able to increase the peak speed of, you sometimes still can tighten up the timings a little. This also helps out too if your CPU has a poor memory controller where you might be able to shove more speed through, but again, sometimes you can tighten up the timings. Also, if you're only using 2 sticks of RAM, make sure if possible to place them into dual channel mode because that gives you a free performance bump. And if you are overclocking, one thing that does help is make sure that they have some airflow over top of them for cooling, because one of the things that tends to help out with stability is just pumping a little bit more voltage through them, but that more voltage needs to get rid of that heat somewhere. If you use an air cooler, it'll probably have enough airflow moving off of itself on its own, but if you're using liquid cooling like myself, you need to make sure that the airflow path of your fans and case have created a nice breeze past your RAM sticks to cool them off. Lastly, a really easy thing is to minimize the amount of stuff that your RAM has to deal with. If you have non-gaming stuff open and running while playing, close that stuff. There's no point keeping Chrome open with 47 active tabs while you're gaming, and on RAM-limited systems especially, you will really notice that kind of stuff. And then lastly, any advice for buying RAM? Well, as I said, at the moment my initial impressions of Corsair are not a good one by any stretch of the imagination. I am extremely disappointed with them. So I would personally advise people not to go that route. My G-Scale RAM that I was using prior, however, I thought it was pretty fantastic. I could even push its clock speeds higher without much fuss. So if you're looking for a good brand, them in particular, they get my vote. However, those are only 2 brands. An easy thing to do is just to take a look at reviews of various RAM sticks before you buy to make sure that you're getting the best bang for your buck. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up for this particular video. Next week, we are going to test CPU performance, including whether or not more cores helps benefit Total Warhammer, and whether or not core speed helps benefit Total Warhammer. So stay tuned for that. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.